This is the documentary Absolute Brain about our time's most critical issue, brain-computer technology. It is also the story of our most influential scientist, Professor Norbert Wiener. He gave us AI and our digital era. It was this book that created the term cyber and initiated our computerized era. Cybernetics represents both brain-computer technology and artificial intelligence, all what supercomputers can create.
Here is the first article about AI, 75 years ago. It was about connecting our brains with the state's research computers. Here, Le Monde with its major article on cybernetics in 1948. See the English text between the lines. They wrote about the first major change in the human brain and gave words to the transcendence of the nervous system. They wondered if it could create the best of all worlds.
In 1956, Science published the news that many researchers shifted to the manipulation of human brains.
At that time, electrodes and other transmitters were used on completely unaware people. The same year, 1956, Professor Just Meerloo published his book on the rape of the mind. It was happening in hospitals around the world. Here you can see a professor who, at a conference in 1959, expressed that one can control movement, sensation, and behavior, that people can be controlled like robots.
Wiener realized the wrong direction his inventions were forced into. Militant power instead of human welfare. He began traveling and lecturing about the threat.
In March 1964, he came to Stockholm and brought it up with Sweden's leading professors. But in the middle of the lecture, he had a heart attack and passed away. This is how he left the Academy of Sciences. He gave humanity artificial intelligence, the information society, digitalization, and computer technology. He was the first to warn about AI and stood on the side of humanity.
One could call Norbert Wiener the most significant scientist ever, because his discoveries delve into human biology, our brains, their functions, and even our behaviors, thus influencing societal development and our future. Cybernetics could have worked wonders for humanity, but was misused. Military power, the state, and not humanity became the focus, and here authorities could intrude into the inner life processes of humans for control and manipulation. Wiener also initiated the discussion about who should have the power over these unparalleled possibilities for better or worse, as he described it, and warned against the military. This is a crossroads for humanity because we risk becoming state components rather than free individuals if we do not take charge of the development ourselves.
Professor Jens Hohenborg from Lund University's Brain Research Department stated in a lecture that electrodes should follow the soft movements of the rest of the brain substance like seaweed, and added that they open up new methods for reading your thoughts and inducing new memories. The Neuronano Research Center at Lund University is developing electrodes both for our brains and to be implanted in the spinal cord. The New York Times has published several editorials. In the first one, from 1967, it was argued that there must be a greater awareness of the threat. The second one, from 1970, predicted that the first experience of life for newborns would be to have transmitters implanted in their brains. During the summer of 1977, they published 30 articles about the CIA's mind control project and concluded with the editorial Control CIA Nat Behavior, which called the project a medical horror story and demanded ethical and legal accountability from the leading government representatives. The film addresses a global development with the most decisive consequences for humanity. The Times declared in 1999 that the CIA's project had made the world darker and compared their chief, biologist Sidney Gottlieb, to the doctors in concentration camps. In Sweden, we had our own Sidney Gottlieb, and he was the head of the institution that developed brain technology. His name was Bori Beck, a general, biologist, neuroprofessor, and head of FOI from 1985. Here lies a threat but also a goldmine. and the settlement has been ongoing in secret for decades about who will ultimately come to possess the power of these unparalleled applications. The connection of our brains to supercomputer systems for an entirely new future planning of state control, alternatively enhancing human abilities, wisdom, energy, health, and quality of life. In Sweden, experiments with unknowing people began in the late 1940s, and this development gained political legitimacy 50 years ago. The government investigation paved the way for large-scale experiments with both our brains and genes. Implants were legalized, which could now be injected, but it was realized that they would be abused to alter people against their will and without their knowledge. Here is another government investigation from the Ministry of Justice the same year, with warnings about the threat. They foresaw an unassailable inhuman state. When this girl received her tattoo in a concentration camp, it was the beginning of state marking. With cybernetics came a new marking, in our brains. Transmitters began to be implanted in us 70 years ago. This one was inserted through a nasal canal during an operation at Swedish in 1967 in an unsuspecting patient. The electrodes in the brain were inserted into a patient at Långbro Mental Hospital in 1970. She herself had no idea how they got into her brain.
Here is 3 arrows inditing transmitters. The top arrows are one implanted into the brain and have destroyed parts of the frontal lobe. All of these have been inserted at the detention center of Stockholm during the years 1972 to 1978 in a person who wasn't aware of what he was subjected to. These transmitters have statements from several professors.
This woman was subjected to abuse with electrodes in her brain in 1946. She died as a result of a prolonged and brutal experiment. Her story is found in the article, Vera Dambor's Death, 10 pages. This electrode is intended to be injected into the brain, through the base of the skull, and the image is taken from the University of Michigan's Neuro Department. It has the same thickness as a hair strand. The following images are from the 1950s when remote control and biomedical research began with animals. A dolphin is fed a prepared radiofish and is then connected to the researchers' project. Here, the same thing. An alligator has a large transmitter inserted and it will transmit all biological information to the state's research computers throughout its lifetime. Now, 70 years later, microchips in animals are used for the same research field. Here is a beetle that 65 years ago received an extra shell which, like all transmitters, emitted a radio wave and returned all the biological information from the beetle's life to the research computers.
Here is a notice of a government acquisition from 1991, published in the Times of India. It refers to the purchase of a 6-channel radio system for behavioral modification in animals. In this particular case, the target was the sacred cows of New Delhi, which were implanted and used in experimental research.
Here comes a series of images. The CIA neutralizes a threat. The incident took place in Jakarta, Indonesia, at St. Carolus Hospital against a Swedish man.
The image exposes a burned area looking like a crater in connection to the brain, where a mushroom-like transmitter is implanted.
Here is the area on the forehead that the CIA opened. Here is an image of what the transmitter looks like when shadows and other obscurities are removed. At St. Carolus Hospital the day before the CIA's assault. Here the day after. The large transmitter was inserted into a detainee at the Stockholm detention center during the latter part of the 1960s without his own knowledge of it. Here are 2 transmitters. The upper one is inserted through a nasal passage and the other embedded at the right temple. Both were implanted at the Karolinska Hospital, which later turned out to collaborate with the American company, de Koning, whose experimental skin material he tested on the woman with lifelong suffering. Here is an article about her.
This X-ray shows an implanted transmitter, and the dark areas in the frontal brain exhibit reduced oxygen levels. The implantation took place during an operation 1990 at a Helsinki hospital.
Here you can see 2 identical transmitters, different in size, inserted into the ear of a little girl during an operation, completely without her or her parents' knowledge.
Life became a long struggle to uncover what she had been subjected to.
And everyone who finds themselves in that situation faces strong resistance and severe hardships, as we will see.
It feels especially brutal when children, or even newborns, are exploited for researchers' experiments. When this boy was a few weeks old in 1948, electrodes were implanted in his brain at Saxka Children's Hospital. Thereafter, the child was injected with extreme doses of penicillin to observe the effect of overdose of the new antibiotic. After that, the boy was living his entire life with mental and physical illnesses. The well-known British surgeon, Sir William Heneage Ogilvie, expressed already in 1952 these words, which demonstrates that a change in relation between doctors and patients are taking place with the new experimental practices. It was published in Gordon Thomas' book here.
Selander published the book Manipulation with Humans in 1970 and wrote, "We are entering a phase that will completely change society, and the politicians do not care." Jacob Palme, the nephew of the Prime Minister, explained that a smaller elite could take charge of development and create an inhumane society. In the same book, Member of Parliament, P.O. Sundman, stated that this meant a development we cannot control. Here, a few years later, with warning words for the politicians. The same warning was given by Professor Lars Christiansen in Dagens Nyheter in 1979, who argued that politicians must act and that it is of utmost importance for every individual. A couple of years later, he was dead, and the subject is still completely unknown. The New York Times has been the world's best newspaper and has published about 200 articles on the development. Most protests and warnings came before behavioral technology made deep interventions in humans. It is said here that Wiener's discoveries were one of the greatest secrets of World War II. And here an admiral says that the Brain Project overlooks human aspects. Here the question is posed about what kind of future we should have. Dr. Delgado was against state coercion and wished to give humans the right to development. The current model, one is fraught with moral problems, and has been the norm since the beginning. It started already at that time, the 1950s. Both in the USA and in Sweden, there were militant institutions behind secrecy. This article mentions that the control of animal experiments is better than those with humans. AI with direct connection to our brains is the threat, and here it is Ralph Nader who realized it already in 1970. When others decide over our brains, we become their slaves. And in conclusion, once again the leader brainwave with the connection of newborns, which has now come a long way. This was not to be revealed to the public, and here are Professor Peter Westerholm's words during a conference at the Ministry of Justice in 1986.
This quote is from the New York Times, 2nd of August in 1977. It is based on a CIA document. It tells of the need to conceal these activities from the American public in general.
This is the reason why both the media and the people live with blindfolds. Here again, in the same speech, he explained that our connection to the research computers was a political process. This includes surveillance, medical research, brain experiments, and behavior modification.
The military FOI leads this development and declare control and manipulation of people's behavior in their agenda. Here is in translation. Here is their agenda of microsystem technology. They declare can be smaller than 1,000 of a millimeter and be spread like bacteria in the air as people inhale. These micro-robots are going to be able to communicate without nervous system.
Here is the EU Commission's project about our lives in these systems. In 2009, they developed artificially living cells, synthetic biology, chemical communication, collective intelligence, and two-way interfaces between brain and computer. The supercomputer systems were described as emotionally intelligent ICT systems, and all these applications are what unsuspecting people are exposed to. This is what these supercomputer systems look like, the emotionally intelligent supercomputers. The American professor, Gary Marks, used the pop band, The Police's song, Every Breath You Take, to describe the new surveillance.
Every breath you take, and every move you make.
This is what they look like. The emotionally intelligent and reliable ICT systems, mentioned by the EU's Brain Project. Here are a few words about their surveillance of us. The text is from various government investigations during the 1980s and 1990s, and this is what was recorded about us at that time. Experimental data on various aspects of the nervous system continue to flow into our computers at an undiminished rate regarding people's life circumstances. Frequent job changes, educational deficiencies, difficulties in managing finances, cohabitation issues, relationships, personal perceptions, behavior, mental status, family conditions, social adaptation, work performance, economic status, debts, opinions on political and religious matters. There are numerous research projects where it is necessary to link information from different points in time about the same person. For example, it might involve tracking opinions during an election campaign. When it comes to segments of the population considered to be particular risks, special methods have been developed to uncover their innermost thought processes. All of this streams into the state's supercomputers via a radio wave that enters the brain, is received by the chip, flows through the body, and is returned to the state's surveillance computers, where the information is stored for a lifetime. When you are connected, your entire life, biologically, mentally, and emotionally, is copied into the supercomputer. After that, the controllers can look into our thoughts, see with our eyes, hear, smell, and feel just as we do. The same confidentiality applies to the human experiments that began around 1950. Here one could follow the hallucinations of mental patients, internally. At Gaustad Mental Hospital in Oslo, electrodes were implanted from this time. Computer systems were developed for the emotions and behaviors of the inmates. All patients at Gaustad were sedated and unknowingly subjected to electrodes in their brains, resulting in experiments. These research titles are taken from the Norwegian government investigation, 2003-33. In this book, authored by a lecturer and a behavioral scientist, one can understand the situation of the mentally ill, subjected to brain experiments. They have all had electrodes in their brains, for several decades. One who broke the confidentiality was Director General Stina Wallström. She saw human rights as more important, and in the Data Inspection Board's yearbook of 1989, she gave these words.
When such research cannot be based on free will, it is necessary for the Parliament to have taken a position on the question of, under what conditions such research should be conducted. It does not belong in a democratic society for people to have to accept such an intrusion as being unknowingly, or against their will, forced to participate in a research project without legal support for such coercion. Consideration must also be given to the commitments Sweden has made in this matter by adhering to international conventions.
We no longer live with this human right, and that means we have lost the right to our lives. Other parts under the highest secrecy were the researchers' self-assumed right to create illness and death for those they exploited. Here it is Professor Gustav Gertz, who revealed it in the book, in 1980. Already in 1960, both the USA, Canada, and Sweden had developed verbal signals that could transmit messages directly into the brain. These signals were identical to voices. Here is another dissertation that mentions that unknowing patients were forced to hear these messages 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, inside their brains. The mental patients often went crazy from it, especially since they didn't know the reason it appeared in their brains. Here are some additional research reports from Dr. Cameron on the same subject.
He mixed medications with experimental substances for interventions in the patient's brains. What happened at the hospitals in Montreal can also provide an idea of what went on globally.
This is an extensive operation, and the EU Commission's Scientific Council demanded a ban on it in their 2005 document. What is referred to as intrusive technology that bypasses normal sensory experiences consists of messages in the form of voices that influence the behavior of those affected. Here is an excerpt from the State of Oregon's law book from 1973, stating that altering people's thoughts and feelings was legalized. This occurred with completely unaware individuals, which the entire subject uses as a model. Here, Dr. Frankenstein made his entrance into societal development for social, behavioral stool, and experimental research with unsuspecting people. And this injection with a mini transmitter was demonstrated by Director General Jan Fries in the book here in the mid-1980s, indicating it was injected into criminals. The first to reveal implanted transmitters at the detention center was Professor Peter Lindström. At the University of California in 1983, 40 years ago, he examined this and many other X-rays from the same person. Here is one of several statements that mention implants in both the head and inside the brain. He describes the implanted transmitter as radio-hypnotic brain control and electronic dissolution of memory. These transmitters were implanted through the nasal passages, when the person, without their knowledge, was sedated at the detention center on various occasions during the 1970s. Despite the silence, there are extensive protests against this development. The most detailed one came from the EU Commission's Scientific Ethics Committee in 2005, when the Swedish professor Göran Hermeren was the chairman. It was 30 pages, with a critical analysis of the situation, forced chipping, the remaking of humans, harmful medical research, interference with brain functions, reduced security, and the question of how far we actually want to accept implants in our brains. Hermeren made significant revelations already in The Price of Knowledge in 1988, when he wrote this, and has been a leading figure in this settlement. What he means, by preventing the authorities' actions, is the researcher's position, with the ability to override, for example, the decisions of the parliament. And it is happening. On a collision course with democracy. Professor McQuire mentioned in his report that his intention was to initiate a conversation about implanting chips in our brains, the exploitation of children, and the totalitarian threat of controlling humans. Professor Bengt Molander stated, "Thou shalt not kill," also means that one should, as best as one can, help one's fellow humans to retain their thoughts and their silence, even if one does not like her thinking ability or finds her silence irritating. Professor Lars Lönnroth drew a parallel with 1930s Germany and argued that criticism of research should be intensified, and that media representatives have not yet acquired enough knowledge and civil courage for their investigative role when it comes to scientific projects with far-reaching consequences for human living conditions. Professor Ole Hagström addressed technology from a broader perspective and said that electronic implants in humans could mean their downfall, and Professor Niels Udenberg saw it as the solution to the democracy problem, and provided information to politicians who see the value of democracy. Spreading knowledge is the solution to the democracy problem in the biological society. In the long run, this could lead to a class society maintained by biological methods, he wrote. When we live in a world with these unknown technopolitical shadows, it is completely normal for conspiracy theories to arise. It is also a consequence of what Håkan Juholt stated in Svenska Dagbladet in October 2017, that within a generation we will live in a technological dictatorship. It cannot be more serious than when a former prime minister, in a book, after leaving politics, explains that we are in a time that not only changes what we do, but who we are. He wrote, "If we are to become someone else, it becomes even more important to ask how that change looks, and in what new reality we wake up, I think." The French member of the National Assembly, Claude Goascon, in December 2004 made a request to the French Minister for State Research for the protection of citizens from psychotechnologies that intrude into the brain. He said, "Manipulation of people, which was previously a subject of science fiction, has emerged as a scientific field. The development therefore forces us to examine ethics and morality." The French neuroscientist, Iquay, was the chairman of their bioethics commission in 1998, when he gave an interview to Nature Reporter, at their conference, explaining that brain technology was a threat to society, a violation of the population, an invasion of human life, brainwashing, and involved state behavior manipulation to which even criminals were subjected. With this development, we abandon all possibilities for freedom and democracy. We are entering a time where the state, not the individual, holds central significance. We become components of others, and many already live in that reality. The new political process, which Professor Peter Westerholm called brain technology, is constantly drawing our society towards an increasingly totalitarian direction, Here we see a couple of hair-thin electrodes from the University of Michigan's neuro department that can be injected directly into the brain, beam, through the skull base. Being biocompatible means that it can remain in the brain for a lifetime. The same goes for this one, and both are intended for researchers who are to be introduced to the subject.
These ones are from the University of Michigan, but are produced as microelectrodes worldwide.
Senator John Glenn dedicated his last 3 years in the Senate to this subject. He said that their family members, the last time they were in the hospital, were incorporated into the experiments. He associated medications with radiation, and it was about biochips and other implants. He expressed that he, and other senators, wanted to stop the experiments and that there was nothing more un-American. The subject is the same in Sweden, and here are the 4 party leaders responsible for bringing the hidden techno-political developments to the public's attention. Here the state consumes its citizens in a form of cannibalism. When the Swedish Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, held its conference in 2021, The Human Mind as a Battlefield, one of the speakers was the American professor James Giordano. He called it a neurological weapon that the USA exploited worldwide with consequences for entire societies.
What we're here to talk about today is the fact that the brain is and will be the 21st century battlescape in many ways. End of story. Out of disclosure, some of the work that I'm doing here today is funded by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. I'm also funded by the European Union Human Brain Project, specifically the Sub-Project 12, where I'm a task leader for dual-use brain science. And I've also done some ongoing work with the Strategic Multi-Level Assessment Crew over the past 10 years at the Pentagon, the Dr. Kabayan's group. My work is fairly well known for the term neuroweanology. Back in 2006 and 2007, we developed a paradigm by which neuroscience could be weaponized, and we assessed that on the world stage. Our work in 2009-10 and the work of the Nuffield Council in 2013 demonstrated that not only was brain science viable and of value to be weaponized, but in many cases it was already being weaponized based upon older technology that was now taking updates and being put increasingly into a variety of circumstances that would yield individuals to be in harm's way. And demonstrated that not only were the brain sciences viable, but they were in fact of high value and were in use globally as neural weapons, to then have a feedback effect that is going to disrupt the process of cognition, emotion, and behavior. What I want you to remember is that these are not weapons of mass destruction. These are weapons of mass disruption, where the disruption can be on the level of the individual, and then creating a ripple effect, not only on that individual and their cohorts, but on larger scales, socioeconomic scales, geopolitical scales, military scales.
He talks about remote control of the brain as a global weapon of mass disruption, deployed by the USA, which is also said to harm people and negatively affect societal functions. There has been an American president who tried to regulate brain systems. The same year he took office, an investigation was requested into the health effects of implants and radio waves in people's bodies. It was noted that pregnant women had an increased risk of giving birth to genetically damaged babies. Here is a quote from the Department of Health that highlighted the critical situation for all pregnant women. What is referred to as radiomedicines are healthcare injections and medicines mixed with biological chips and nanomaterials that attach to the body and transmit through it with a radio wave. Even the fetus during its development. The Department of Health wrote that it also increases the risk of both cancer and genetic damage, which can occur many years later. As they wrote, this radio table was published by Professor Stuart McKay in the dissertation, Telemetry is Coming of Age, 1980. It shows the frequencies that then entered the heads of American citizens after they had been admitted to the hospital. We live with the same threat to our lives and health in Sweden. The government investigation addressed the brain, and from that, we can understand the cause of mental disorders.
In United States, 22% of all young people having behavioral disturbances.
When these brain systems were established throughout the Western world, around 1970 to 1980, new circumstances arose for human health. SOU 1991-17 from the National Board of Health and Welfare, mentioned that a completely new disease panorama with long-lasting and chronic illnesses emerged at that time. It brought with it mental health issues with behavioral disorders, brain diseases, brain stress, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, increased violence, and an increasingly brutal society. These were consequences of connecting our brains to these systems. Uppsala University wrote in 2022 that there was an increase in children with genetic damage. They were called very common, and they explained that genetic changes were reported worldwide. It is not just unfortunate circumstances, but a consequence of the genetic modification that was legalized with SOU 1972-59. The one with the subtitle, Choosing the Future. The disease panorama was accompanied by chronic illnesses that are constantly increasing, with now about half of the population living with these problems. Approximately 2.5 million people live with 2 or more chronic diseases. Among the common ones is chronic pain, a normal consequence of radio waves in the body, where chronic migraines, fatigue, depression, mental illnesses and heart diseases are others. When FOI deployed its microsystem technology in the atmosphere, the Swedish Research Council warned about stressing the heart, and other organs as they enter us through the skin and breathing. And here we see a research report on increased diseases and particles in the air. Here comes the EU Council's text translated. Should we accept living under a state that creates irreversible damage and diseases for its population with implants that affect the brain, intervening in our inner selves with systems to modify us, so that we fit their desires?
Here is another excerpt from the official government inquiry that marked the beginning of political brain technology in Sweden. It discusses how these systems can influence human genes, the brain, and behavior. This is the same in every country where these systems are established.
To provide an understanding of the implants, a person can have several transmitters implanted, where different institutions conduct multiple experiments. Many have also received implants in other countries, where different experiments are conducted in the brain of the same victim. A few years ago, Springer's Neuroethics published a research report from the Netherlands, titled, "Was it my brain implant that made me do it?" It was mentioned that deep brain stimulation caused abnormal behaviors, impaired memories, depression, and increased suicidal tendencies. The report also addressed changes in personality, thoughts, desires, and raised the question of legal responsibility when the implants influence the occurrence of events. When the state, behind the back of the individual, through medical fraud, has integrated the population into systems for deep brain stimulation, with the most destructive consequences for both health and social life, then we must say stop. The abuse she referred to was the manipulation of people's perceptions, but it also became the pharmaceutical company's biggest goldmine through the extensive chronic illnesses the abuse brought with it. Another change that has increasingly affected the brain through radio communication is the functions of the so-called blood-brain barrier system. It manifests as a physiological degeneration, which is believed to cause Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. The medical dissertation, Cerebral Implant Studies, conducted in 1976 by Dr. Samford J. Larson with 9 colleagues explained, like many others, that radiation in the brain altered its functions and had severe consequences, including Parkinson's and Alzheimer's.
We have entered an era in which a more advanced model of Islamic genital mutilation has been implemented throughout the Western world. The traditional form has been upgraded. Stated Islamic genital and Islamic child beat organ actions of fast. It has now moved to the brain, where cerebral mutilation is the central method. It mirrors what these young girls are sacrificed for, the right of a higher and invisible power to take what they want. A form of rape that is tolerated. The old knives and razor blades have now been replaced with medical transmitters, embedding changes to human rights, behavior, opinions, and the courage to resist.
Here lies a funeral that many see as the threat, where AI takes over society and our minds. This also includes what many see as restrictions, both on freedom of speech and democracy. Here is the reason why more and more states are becoming totalitarian and are drawn towards fascist ideals. The threat is increasing. Soon we won't be able to open our mouths before being drowned by invisible state coercion. We have reached a situation where humans are surpassed by computerized systems that control development. They are already penetrating into our brains and genes. The question is, what should be buried? The people or the new totalitarian idea that we should all live with forced implants in our brains? Can humans open up the brain systems to debate? Or will the official line with the Prime Minister, generals, security services and psychiatry succeed in silencing everything about implant politics? Here, everything is on the move. In the aftermath, all old traditional truths are changing. The society that was once built for humans has become the state we all must live for. Once again, the current AI development, where instead of free people with their own opinions, we become components to be controlled with behavioral technology and exploited as biological material. Here arises a new cannibalism, where the state consumes its population and our brains. What is in the final speech? Isn't it everyone's right to know? It's about our brains. Who took the right to sell us out? Now we stand here, with a coffin before us, questioning what should be in it. Is it our brains, we who are the people, our right to our lives, everything that is called human, that should be buried? Or should we manage to open up the debate? Free ourselves, change the course, reshape society, and see human rights, not state power, as the foundation.
We face the ultimate question of our time. Will humanity retain the sovereign right to its own brains and genes? Or will these be nationalized in the new technocratic era the world has entered? This is the most critical issue humanity has ever faced, as militant agencies and pharmaceutical companies have already taken control of human biology. Those in power must look beyond state control and profit. This concerns the survival of human dignity, the future of life itself, and the right of Homo sapiens to exist without becoming political raw material.
Everyone walking here on Drottninggatan in Stockholm, just like throughout the Western world, is connected to state supercomputers and subjected to a hidden political and human transformation. It enters their brains with behavior technology, directing societal changes. Most of those people we're meeting in the streets suffer from some form of chronic illness, and many are used in brain experiments, forced to live with reduced health, misused in medical research, not having the right to be who they are, the goal of behavior technology, and more consequences of state abuse against their minds.
Absolute brain is a free brain. Mind, brain, and the chain of behavior manipulation. Implants, brain-computer interaction, and state rape of mind control. Weapons of mass disruption. Remote control, radio communication interference in our brains. Neuroscience weaponized. Enter the battle of our minds. Absolute brain is a free brain.